I want to start by telling you a story, not a debate point, not a soundbite, not a Twitter thread, but a story about how a brown kid from a working-class Muslim family in the UK ended up spending his adult life defending a faith that so many people insist they already understand and yet so clearly don't. Because for me, Islam was never just a headline or a controversy or a security issue. It was the smell of my mom's cooking after school. It was my dad waking me up gently for Fajr prayers. It was the quiet dignity of my grandparents who had crossed continents with little more than faith and hope in their pockets. And when I look back now, what strikes me is not how political my upbringing was, but how profoundly normal it was, because Islam in my childhood wasn't about us versus them. It wasn't about extremism or terrorism or identity politics. It was about ethics, about compassion, about charity, about discipline, about humility, about being answerable to something bigger than yourself. And yet, as I grew older, I realized that the world I was stepping into had already made up its mind about what Islam was, and more importantly, what Muslims were. And I remember the first time I felt that sharp jolt of otherness, not because someone called me a slur or threw a punch, but because a teacher casually said in class, after 9/11, that Islam had a violence problem. And I remember thinking, wait a second, the people who taught me Islam taught me not to hit, not to steal, not to lie, to stand up for the weak, to speak truth to power. So how did we get from there to here? How did a religion followed by nearly 2 billion people get reduced to a caricature defined by its worst actors? And how did I, a kid who loved cricket and hip-hop and The Simpsons, suddenly become an unofficial spokesperson for a global faith every time something bad happened somewhere in the world? And I think that's where my journey really began, because it wasn't just about defending Islam from ignorance. It was about interrogating my own faith, my own assumptions, my own community, and asking hard questions that some people didn't want asked. Like, why do we sometimes retreat into victimhood instead of self-criticism? Why do we let cultural practices masquerade as religious mandates? Why do we tolerate misogyny and authoritarianism when our own scripture speaks of justice and equality? And why, on the other side, do non-Muslims feel so comfortable making sweeping generalizations about Muslims that will be considered racist if applied to any other group? And so I started reading more deeply. Not just Islamic texts, but history and politics and philosophy. And I started debating, first in university halls and then on television screens, because I realized that silence wasn't an option, that if Muslims didn't tell our own stories, others would tell them for us, and they wouldn't be kind, they wouldn't be fair, they wouldn't be accurate. And I also realized something else, something uncomfortable, which is that Islamophobia isn't just about fear of Islam. It's about power. It's about who gets to define reality, who gets to set the tone of the conversation, who gets to decide which lives matter and which don't. And when Western governments bomb Muslim countries, it's called foreign policy. But when a Muslim commits violence, it's called Islamic terrorism. And the double standard isn't accidental, it's structural. It is baked into our media, our politics, our culture. And as a journalist, I couldn't ignore that. Because journalism, at its best, is about exposing hypocrisy and holding power to account. And so when I talk about Islam, I'm not just talking about a set of beliefs, I'm talking about how those beliefs are misrepresented, weaponized, and politicized in a world that is deeply unequal. And I remember one debate in particular, early in my career, when someone said to me, Mehdi, why can't Muslims just reform their religion the way Christians did? And I remember thinking, first of all, Christianity didn't reform itself into modernity peacefully. It went through centuries of war, colonization, slavery, and bloodshed. And second of all, Muslims are constantly reforming, constantly debating, constantly reinterpreting. But you don't hear about that because it doesn't fit the narrative. Because a Muslim feminist scholar doesn't make faux art as sexy a headline as a bearded extremist with a gun. And that's when it hit me that my role, whether I liked it or not, was to complicate the story, to refuse the easy answers, to say, yes, there are real problems in Muslim societies. And yes, extremism is a real threat, but no, Islam is not the cause of all of it. And no, bombing and banning and surveilling Muslims is not the solution. And that's not a popular position, because it angers both sides. It angers the Islamophobes who want simple villains, and it angers the ultra-conservatives who want simple heroes. But if there's one thing Islam taught me, it's that truth is rarely comfortable and justice is rarely convenient. And so my most powerful take on Islam isn't a slogan or a tweet. It's this: Islam is not a problem to be solved. It's a tradition to be understood, a faith to be lived, and a community to be humanized. And until we start doing that, we are going to keep talking past each other. We're going to keep repeating the same tired arguments, and we're going to keep failing the very people who deserve better, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Let me tell you about the moment when I realized just how deeply misunderstood Islam really is, because it wasn't in a mosque or a classroom. It was in a TV studio under bright lights with a countdown clock ticking in the corner of the screen, and I was about to debate someone who had built their entire career on portraying Muslims as a civilizational threat. And as we sat there waiting for the cameras to roll, he leaned over and said, "You know, Mehdi, I actually like you. You're not like the other Muslims." And I smiled politely, but inside I was screaming. Because what he really meant was, you're palatable, you're fluent in my language, you dress like me, you argue like me, you make me feel comfortable. And that's when it dawned on me that for a lot of people, the problem isn't Islam per se, it's Muslims who don't assimilate into a narrow, white, secular norm. And so when I went on air and he started talking about Sharia law, taking over Britain and no-go zones and Muslim birth rates, I didn't just counter him with facts. Although I did that too, I tried to tell a different story. I talked about how Sharia for most Muslims means personal ethics, prayer, fasting, charity, not stonings and amputations. Talked about how Muslims have lived in Britain for over a century, serving in the army, work in the NHS, paying taxes, raising families, contributing to culture. And I talked about how the obsession with Muslim demography is eerily similar to the old racist panics Abu Jews and Catholics outbreeding real Brits. And afterwards, when the show was over, a young Muslim woman came up to me in the audience and said with tears in her eyes, "Thank you for making me feel seen." And that's when I realized that these debates aren't just intellectual exercises, they're about people's lives, about whether a kid grows up feeling proud of who they are or ashamed of it, about whether a woman feels safe wearing a hijab on the street or constantly looks over her shoulder, and about whether a whole community feels like it belongs or feels like it's forever on probation. And that's why I get so frustrated when people reduce Islam to a list of problem verses or backward practices, because every religion has difficult texts, every culture has ugly customs, and yet somehow only Islam is expected to answer for every sin committed in its name. And let me be clear here, because people love to misquote me, I am not saying Islam is perfect or Muslims are beyond criticism. Far from it. I have criticized blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, gender inequality, homophobia, sectarianism, authoritarian cleric, and I will continue to do so, because I believe that a faith that cannot be questioned is a faith that cannot grow. But what I am saying is that those critiques should come from a place of knowledge and consistency, not prejudice and double standards, because when Western governments ally with brutal dictators in the Muslim world, sell them weapons, and then act as hawked when instability and extremism follow, that's not Islam's fault. That's geopolitics. And when social and economic marginalization pushes young Muslims into despair, and a tiny minority of them turn to violence, that's not Islam's fault either. That's a failure of policy and community, and yet Islam is the convenient scapegoat because it absolves everyone else of responsibility. And so my most powerful take on Islam is not just theological, it's political. It's about how power operates, how narratives are constructed, how fear is manufactured, and how entire populations are dehumanized in the press. And I remember once being asked on a panel, "Do you condemn ISIS?" And I said, "Of course I do. I condemn them unequivocally. But let me ask you something. Do you ask every Christian to condemn the Ku Klux Klan? Do you ask every Jew to condemn the crimes of the Israeli government? Do you ask every white person to condemn every mass shooter?" The room went quiet because the question exposed the absurdity of collective guilt, and that is what Muslims are subjected to every day. This idea that we are all responsible for the action of a tiny, violent fringe, and that we must constantly prove our loyalty, our moderation, our humanity, and that constant pressure takes a psychological toll. It makes people defensive, it makes people angry, it makes people retreat into identity politics, and ironically, it creates the very polarization that the Islamophobes claim to fear. And that's why I keep saying that if you really care about combating extremism, if you really care about social cohesion, if you really care about human rights, then you need to stop treating Islam as the enemy and start treating Muslims as partners. You need to invest in education, in jobs, in housing, in mental health, in community dialogue. You need to stop bombing countries into the Stone Age and then acting surprised when refugees show up at your borders, and you need to hold your own leaders accountable for the messes they create, because Islam is not a monolith, Muslims are not a hive mind, and the future of this faith will not be determined by terrorists or demagogues. T will be determined by ordinary believers who are trying to live decent lives in an increasingly hostile world. And if there's one thing I've learned from all my years of arguing about Islam on TV and online, it's that empathy is more powerful than any statistic that story, are more persuasive than any policy paper. And that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply insist on the humanity of people who have been turned into abstractions. So let me end by telling you what I really mean when I say this is my most powerful take on Islam, because it is not just about defending my faith from critics. It's about reimagining what it means to be a Muslim in the 21st century and what it means for non-Muslims to live alongside Muslims in a pluralistic society. And for me, that starts with honesty, with acknowledging that Muslims have agency, that we are not just victims of Western imperialism or media bias, but active participants in shaping our own destinies. And that means confronting the dark chapters of our own history, the authoritarian regimes, the clerical abuses of power, the sectarian violence, the treatment of women and minorities, and saying this is not who we want to be. This is not what our faith calls us to be. Because if Islam means anything, it means submission to justice, to mercy, to truth, not submission to tyrants or traditions that have lost their moral compass. And at the same time, it means demanding fairness from the societies we live in. It means saying to our fellow citizens, you cannot preach human rights abroad while violating them at home. You cannot celebrate diversity while demonizing Muslims. You cannot claim to stand for freedom while surveilling, profiling, and excluding entire communities. And that dual responsibility, inward and outward, is what makes this conversation so difficult and so necessary. Because it's much easier to point fingers than to look in the mirror, and yet that's exactly what Islam, at its best, asks us to do. To engage in self-accountability, to question our intention, to examine our actions, and to strive constantly to do better. And I think about the young Muslims I meet all the time, students, activists, artists, entrepreneurs who are trying to reconcile their faith with their politics, their spirituality with their skepticism, their heritage with their hopes. And I see in them not a problem to be fixed, but a promise to be nurtured, because they are refusing the false choice between being fully Muslim and fully Western. They are saying we can be both. We can draw from our tradition without being trapped by it. We can challenge injustice without becoming cynical. We can belong without disappearing. And that, to me, is the future of Islam. Not some mythical caliphate, not a return to a romanticized past, but a dynamic, plural, ethically grounded faith that speaks to the realities of our time. And when people ask me, Mehdi, why do you keep doing this? Why do you keep stepping into hostile studios? Why do you keep arguing with trolls? Why do you keep writing these articles and making these speeches? I tell them it's because I believe in the power of ideas. I believe that narratives shape policies. Policies shape lives. And I believe that if we don't challenge bad ideas, they will harden into common sense, and then into law, and then into violence. And I've seen what happens when fear goes unchallenged. I've seen families torn apart by deportations. I've seen mosques vandalized. I've seen kids bullied. I've seen wars justified, all in the name of defending against a religion that most people have never actually bothered to understand. And that's why my most powerful take on Islam is ultimately a simple one, even if it takes 1,000 words to explain it. And it's this: Islam is not your enemy. Ignorance is. Islam is not inherently violent. Injustice is. Islam is not incompatible with modernity. Authoritarianism is. And Muslims are not a threat to your way of life. They are your neighbors, your colleagues, your doctors, your teachers, your friends, your fellow citizens. And the sooner we start seeing each other not as symbols, but as human beings, not as stereotypes, but as stories, not as problems, but as partners, the sooner we can start building a world that is worthy of all of us. And I don't pretend that this is easy. I don't pretend that dialogue will solve everything. I don't pretend that there aren't real, painful conflicts that need real, painful compromises. But I do know that the alternative, the path of suspicion, scapegoating, and silence leads only to more division, more violence, and more grief. And as a Muslim, as a journalist, as a citizen of this planet, I refuse to accept that as inevitable. I refuse to let the loudest, angriest voices define my faith or my future. And I refuse to stop telling this story, not because I think it will magically change the world overnight, but because I know that every honest conversation, every challenged assumption, every moment of empathy is a small act of resistance against a culture of fear. And if there's one thing Islam has taught me, it's that small acts of resistance, done with sincerity and persistence, can move mountains.